Welcome to the Publish Her podcast, a place where you can come to get inspiration, motivation, help, encouragement, and support in your journey to write, publish, and sell your book. Hosted by Alexa Bigwarfe.
'Cause I've been where you've been, and I felt what you're feeling, and I don't want to get in your way.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Publish Her podcast. I'm Alexa Bigwarfe, host of the podcast, and today I am really pleased to bring you Sara Letourneau, is the book editor, writing coach, and workshop instructor at Heart of the Story Editorial and Coaching Services. She works with authors and writers to help them develop the skills, knowledge, and confidence they need so they can finish their manuscripts, polish them for publication, and stay focused and motivated as they reach for their writing goals and embrace their creativity. Sara is also an award-winning poet and the co-founder of the Pour Me a Poem open mic in Mansfield, Massachusetts. Her debut poetry collection, Wild Gardens, will be published by Kelsey Books in 2024. You know, that's really awesome that you speak to the poetry side as well as the general editing, because we always have the wonderful poets that show up in our community and say, when are you going to have someone come talk to us about poetry? So congratulations on your new book.
Thank you very much. It's still sinking in. I think it's because I'm at that stage where I'm now waiting for the production side to begin. And that's not going to be until June. But when that does happen, then I'll get to see the cover art, and the first, not proof, but the first laid out version of the manuscript. And last I knew, I think the book should be out by late August or sometime September of next year.
That is so exciting. And I love it when our providers in the community are also authors, because you know and feel the excitement of all those things, like seeing the cover and seeing the print proof and all of those fun things.
Yeah.
So,
and
yay.
Those are all things that I'm planning to share as time goes on social media and also through my email list. In fact, my email list will get the first glance at all of that.
Oh, fun.
But yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing how all of that unfolds over the next several months.
Oh, that's so great. Well, congratulations again. We are not talking about poetry today, though. We are talking about the whole idea of showing versus telling. And it's really interesting. Right before we started recording, I said, okay, so we're talking about showing, not telling today. And Sara piped in and said, well, actually, there's sometimes when you should tell instead of show. So I guess let's start off with, first of all, for our newest authors, they may not have heard this expression yet, show, don't tell. If you've been around in the writing world for a while, I'm sure you hear this all the time. But can you just first give us an overview of what it means when an editor tells you need to show, not tell?
So I'll break down first the two parts of that. Showing is all about description. And yes, that can be describing a character's physical appearance or what the setting in a particular scene looks like, but it's also talking about a character's actions and movements. It's also talking about sensory details. Basically, showing is a way of writing that allows the reader to experience what is happening in the story and to help them feel immersed in the scene. So as if they kind of feel like they're there. And so they also feel connected with the characters for that reason. Telling, on the other hand, is more like summarizing. So it's not about details. It's more about explanation or facts, even the little mundane information as well. And so telling is different from showing, because showing, because of all the detail, has a slightly slower pacing. And so when it comes to telling, the pacing tends to be a little bit faster, and it's written in a way to help the story move forward and to help maintain a steady pacing, especially when nothing really exciting is happening in the story.
Yeah, there's sometimes you just need to tell what happened without having to go into all the details. This is one of those things that when I first started the transition from being completely a nonfiction writer to becoming a fiction writer was really challenging for me, because in nonfiction, now creative nonfiction, that you do more of it, but in the type of nonfiction that I was writing, more prescriptive type stuff, it's
Mhm.
literally just all telling, because you're giving information, and sometimes you add in a story or something like that. So this was super challenging for me, and
Mhm.
it sounds easy. You're like, oh, that's so obvious, we're just going to give some more details, but then you get down to actually do it and you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing. It's so much easier to
Mhm.
just say she got up in the morning and she put on her clothes and then she went to the store and then she did the whatever and the whatever. And sometimes those are the details you just tell. But
Mhm.
for the reader to really be in that experience with
Mhm.
us, you need more of those details. What she's seeing, how it is she feel, is the floor cold when she gets, puts her feet on the cold floor out of the bed. So can you give some examples of how people can take things that would be a traditional like scene that they would get caught up in just telling, and how you make it more
Mhm.
of a showing event?
Um, well, the first thing the writer can do is to think about, especially if they're writing fiction, um, think about what the character is seeing or experiencing.
Mhm.
So like if just to go on to the example that Alexa was using, if they go into the grocery store, what does this particular character notice while they're shopping? What do they go shopping for? Why are they shopping for these things? Um, what do they smell when they're in the grocery store? Because you can smell all kinds of things at a grocery store. Um, and so things like that. It's not just about, again, it's not just about what they're seeing, but also the other senses. So again, not just the smelling, like I mentioned, but also like, is it wintertime? And the character had to grab one of the carriages from outside, and they're still wearing their gloves because the metal of the carriage is still cold.
Mhm.
So it's things like that. Another thing that I consider to be part of showing and telling is, and mention this because this is a thing I sometimes see with my authors, um, is sometimes they summer if a character is sharing something important through dialogue, always show the dialogue by writing it out rather than summarizing what the character says. And the reason for that, it's a different angle of showing and telling than what I was just saying a moment ago. But when you show a character's dialogue, when you actually write out what they are saying rather than summarizing it, not only are you sharing important information that's key to the story, but you're also sharing something about the character that's speaking. Sometimes the very words or the tone of voice that they use says a lot about who they are. And that can't really be captured as well when you are summarizing or telling the reader what the person said as opposed to writing out the dialogue itself.
Mhm.
And um, one other important time for showing is the first time a character go visits a very important setting in the book.
Mhm.
And you know how when any of us, and maybe you've done the same thing too, Alexa, the first time you go someplace, you kind of can't help but look at your surroundings because you've never been there before. And so you sort of take a moment to absorb what you see and, like again, what you smell or the sounds that you hear there. Um, and the same thing happens in instances like that in a story. If the protagonist visits a very important setting, even if it's the grocery store, because maybe they meet someone really important at the grocery store, you would take that very first time that the character visits the grocery store in the story to just write a little bit about what the character sees or notices about the interior of that grocery store, or maybe the exterior, like if it's wintertime and it's Christmas and there are Christmas decorations outside. So it's things like that that help the reader to almost feel like they're becoming part of the story. They can see the setting, they can all hear what's happening, and that's what happens when showing is done effectively. And those are 3 times when it really helps to do that.
It always I like to give calculus as an example because when I was in college, I don't know why I took calculus. I didn't need it. I got a bad grade in it. I should have never taken it. But I always use this example when I'm explaining things like this, where when I hear someone describe something, it makes perfect sense. But when I go to apply, it's really more challenging. It's like in calculus, like he would list out all these formulas and work through them. And I'm sitting in class and I'm like, that totally makes sense. I see how he gets from A to Z. And then we'd have a test and he'd give the test question, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have no idea how to do step 2, 3, and 4. And sometimes I felt like might be something wrong with my mental processing, because I'm like, why is this so hard for me? But I do really struggle with, even when going to the grocery store, not slipping into that. It's funny that we use grocery store because I have a really important scene in my rom-com that takes place in a grocery store. And what's happening is these two friends are shopping together, and one of them is having a meltdown basically about her broken heart. And they're in the grocery store. So it's like, how do you use the environment to help them in there? So we talked about like the smelly cheeses, they're in France, and picking out the wine bottles and the expression
Oh,
other grocery shoppers were giving them as they're doing their silly little things, as she's like crying and having this meltdown. But it's so easy for me to slide back into that just pure, like, just describing what's happening, but in telling way, where there are no emotions in there. So how do you have advice on, like, when you find yourself slipping into a place where, as you're rereading what you've written, and you can see it in the writing, it's like, and then she did this, and then she did this, and then this person said this, and then this person said this, how you can, if showing is difficult for you, how you can bring those other things into it to make it just better.
yeah, no, absolutely. So the key, there are a couple of keys. First, if you notice that it feels like the story's moving too quickly, like if it feels like it's rushing, um, that's one sign that the passage could benefit from showing, because as I mentioned earlier, showing slows down the pacing a little bit, whereas telling sort of speeds it up.
Mhm.
So pay attention to that. Another thing you can do is sometimes if you have, and this is if you have trouble determining how much on the page is showing and how much is telling, you can always take two different colored highlighters, and one can represent telling, the
Oh.
other can represent showing. And so whenever you see that you are showing or telling, you would use the respective highlighter, whether it's doing showing in yellow and telling in orange, let's say. And then you find afterward that there's a lot of orange on the page.
Mm.
I would also look at those areas, because then that's signaling to you through the color coding that there may be too much telling. And then when you really get into it, the question to ask yourself is, how can I expand on this? If my character is in this scene, what are they doing at this moment besides speaking?
Mhm.
Um, but and also again, what does the place look like, or what details would my character notice that would be important to share here?
Yeah, and really doing the things that I think help, like, create the emotions of the
Mm-hmm.
scene too. I think to me
Mm-hmm.
that's the biggest thing. Like when
Yeah.
you keep telling, there's no emotional, it's just like a
Mm-hmm.
list.
Yeah. And that's the funny thing about emotion, is when you are in showing, um, how the character feels may also impact how the description is written, because they may be, if they go to a grocery store one day and they're in a really good mood, they may notice other things that make them feel differently about the grocery store than, say, if they went there when they were in an absolutely awful mood.
Right.
Like your two characters you were talking about, Alexa, both of them may, depending on who's the point of view character, each one may feel a little bit differently.
Mm.
And so it is also important to ask yourself, what is my character feeling? How do they feel right now? And how does that influence the details that are shared through showing? Like, does that impact what they notice or how they respond to the different sensory items in the setting.
Yeah. I sat in on a session one time when I was first starting to learn how to do this, and I'll never forget. She gave some really good tips too, and that have always stuck with me. Like sometimes it's about the emotions and the descriptions, but she was like,
Mm-hmm,
you can also show through their actions. Like what are they
mm-hmm,
doing? Like she was talking about a woman who was thinking about cheating on her husband, and so as she's describing her, she said the whole time she was talking, the woman was twisting her wedding ring the whole time she
mm-hmm.
was talking to this. So those
Yeah.
little things that like build
Mm-hmm.
that like
Yep.
angst around the
Mm-hmm.
situation. I was like, that's such a great idea because
It,
I never think about that kind of stuff. Like, what are they physically doing that
yeah.
brings into it?
Yeah. Because those little actions that they're doing as they're talking say a lot about how they're feeling. And
Mhm.
so, just to come back to a tip, if you are writing dialogue and you find that you just do all dialogue, um, it's important every now and then to sort of break up the dialogue by including a sentence, sort of like what Alexa was just talking about. What is the character doing
Mhm.
while they are speaking? And it could be, I don't want to say a pointless action, but sometimes, let's say it's a phone conversation that's being shown. And sometimes you want to, you may want to mention what the protagonist, the point of view character, is doing while they're on the phone or how they're
Mhm.
holding the phone. Um, but especially those little things that indicate how the character who's speaking may be feeling at that moment. Again, twisting of the ring or holding their head in their hands
Mhm.
because, oh my goodness. Um, or it could even be as simple as taking a very tentative sip of coffee, maybe because they're hesitating or trying to put off what it is that they are going to tell the other character. So all those things, it does require thought and practice, but um if you and once you do put in the practice, that those elements are going to help bring your story to life even more than with just telling.
It's funny that you went right into that because my next question was going to be, why
Mhm.
is this so hard? And how do we practice it? So we know why it's hard because it's not the natural, like description is, unless you're just a natural born storyteller where you've met
Mhm.
those people who just tell you all the details and you can see yourself in there. Like it does take
Mhm.
practice.
It
How do we practice it?
You just do. It is one of it's I think the pointers that I shared a moment ago when it comes to identifying when you're doing too much telling and how you can incorporate more showing. Um, Doing that kind of exercise can help. I wouldn't worry about trying to balance showing and telling too much when you're writing a first draft, only because then that's one of those things that you can get so easily hung up on while you're
Yeah.
first drafting, and it can cause the drafting to take longer than it really needs to. So I would say wait until you're revising. Don't worry about it when you're doing the first draft, but as you're revising, doing that kind of exercise can help you identify the areas where you need to do more showing, or in some instances when you're maybe doing too much showing, because I also see that as well.
Yeah.
And so in those instances when it may be helpful to think about how you can not just cut stuff out, but maybe condense it so that you're telling rather than showing.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question to you. You mentioned this in the very beginning that some you need a balance of both, and sometimes it's better to tell than show. So, what are some times that show telling is the best option?
Telling is the best option when you're sharing, first of all, background information about a character, about a place, or even historical information about a setting or something that may have happened before the story takes place. Um, Sometimes writers can go into too much depth about this, and that can lead to another term that writers can often hear, info dumping.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you are, again, when you are revising this draft and you're doing that exercise of highlighting what's showing and what's telling, and if you get to an area where you're sharing information about one of the supporting characters or an important setting that's not description related, but rather information that the character may or the narrator may know about this person or this place. If you find that there's a lot of telling, or not, excuse me, there's a lot of showing in terms of sharing that background information, that's one of the areas where it's good to think about, okay, what is most important for the reader to know about this character, this place, or so on right now?
Yeah.
Can any of this be saved for later? And can any of it be condensed into telling? And also what can be taken out?
Yeah.
Another time is when something happens off the page that the protagonist does not participate in, but finds out about later on. Maybe it's conveyed to them through dialogue by another character. Either way, because the protagonist was not present for that, and also because it didn't happen on the page, it happened off the page. That's often another time to use telling, because how can the narrator or the protagonist possibly put in those sensory details or other things that would be included in showing when they weren't there?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and another time, again, if you're doing this exercise that Alexa and I have been talking about with the highlighters, and you find that there is too much showing, that's another time. It doesn't really matter what the showing may be about. Sometimes it's good to just revert back to telling, because the pacing
Yeah.
may be affected. The pacing may be slowing down too much because of all the detail. And also, detail, when there's a lot of it, can be very mentally taxing on the
Yeah.
on the reader,
Yeah.
because it just requires more focus from them. And if there's too much of it, that's when it can feel like the story's getting bogged down by all the detail. And so in instances like this, where there's too much detail and it's affecting the pacing and also affecting how the reader feels about the story, because they may start to be losing interest in the story at this point. This is another point when it's really important to see how you can summarize some of what's happening and turn it into telling, because that will help to even out the pacing a little bit more.
Mhm.
And it also won't be as mentally taxing on the reader.
Yeah, moving the story forward. So, if this is a topic that you struggle with, dear listeners, Sara, you work with authors. Can you want to tell about the capacities that you work with them? What kind of services you offer?
Sure. So I am a book coach. I offer one-on-one coaching to help writers with their writing. So it doesn't matter if you are in the middle of a manuscript and you know you need help with craft elements, or holding yourself accountable because it's taken you 2 years to write the first 30,000 words. Or if you're right at the beginning of a project. So I actually get quite a few brand new authors who have these ideas, but they don't really know how to get started on it. And the idea of starting a book on their own feels very overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so any of those scenarios, I meet the authors where they are at. We talk about their project and what their needs are. And then the coaching is customized to that project and to their needs. So if they're in the middle of revising a manuscript and they want some feedback on a short excerpt, like a couple pages, to see if they're nailing elements like showing or telling, I can do that. If they need the accountability, or if they need help with craft, anything that has to do with the writing side, that's what I'm there. That's what I can help through the coaching. I'm also a book editor. And in both the editing and the coaching, I do work in both nonfiction and fiction. In fiction, I work in speculative fiction, YA fiction, literary fiction, primarily. And then in nonfiction, memoir, creative nonfiction, self-help books, or prescriptive nonfiction as well. So yeah, if you have a manuscript that you're looking for big picture feedback on, or you need someone to look at punctuation, spelling, grammar, making sure that there are no errors in the prose and that everything reads smoothly, those are things, I can help with that as well.
Awesome. So Sara is one of our bronze sponsors for the 2024 Women in Publishing Summit. And she's got a special offer for our community. First of all, thank you so much for sponsoring, because the sponsorships help us keep the price of the conference low. It helps us keep programming going every single month. We'll be doing another webinar with Sara in the summer of 2024. Topic to be determined, but I don't know, maybe we should dig into some poetry for our poetry folks.
I
We'll
would
see.
love to do that, if that is something, if any poets who are listening to this podcast come to the Women in Publishing Summit in 2024 and you want a poetry webinar, please let me know. I would be happy to take that request and put together something that's very special for you.
We will definitely poll the community on that, because we get that question. We don't have a lot of poets, but I think there's a growing number of them. I mean, even one of our community members who's written 2 romantic suspenses just published a poetry book. So I think there's maybe more poets lurking in our community than we realize. So that would be really cool. But if you
Absolutely.
go to womeninpublishingsummit.com/heart of story, that will direct you over to Sara's page, and you want to tell them what you have for them over there.
Yeah, so my sponsor offer for the 2024 summit is one free 45-minute coaching call. So all the things we talked about earlier, if you would like a little bit of feedback on a short excerpt of your work in progress, or if you need help with brainstorming, or you want to do a craft talk, it's pretty open. What else have we talked about? I've looked at people's query letters. I have, and now I'm drawing a blank on the rest of them. It's
A lot of
pretty,
things.
a lot of things. Or even if it's talking about, or even if it's developing a better understanding of the genre that you're writing in, or your target audience, and the things to keep in mind as you are writing to those particular things. Those are, as I said, it's very open-ended in terms of what we can do. It's all a matter of meeting you where you are at right now, and then giving you the guidance and support that you need.
I think that's fantastic. So make sure, if you have been listening to this and feel like Sara is the person you want to learn more from, head over to womeninpublishingsummit.com/heart of story. Otherwise, you are all over the place in terms of social media, website, all that stuff. You want to tell people where they can go to follow you?
Sure. So my website is heartofthestoryeditorial.com. You can also find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Unfortunately, the handle for each one of those is different for various reasons.
I did the same
But
thing.
honestly, if you Google, if you put in for the search Sara Letourneau, last name spelled Letourneau, or Heart of the Story in the search for any of those 3 social media, you should find me.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. I really appreciate all of your tips on moving through what I think is one of the biggest challenges for new writers, really, when it comes into creating those books that people just get lost in. It really is understanding how to show very well. And like you said, understanding the balance between showing and telling to keep the pacing right. But this
Mhm.
has been a great conversation. And again, I just want to thank you for sponsoring our conference and for being a great part of our community. And we look forward to your upcoming webinar in the summer as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alexa. It's been great chatting with you.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too.
You don't have to give me your heart. You don't have to give it away. You don't gotta
Thank you for
love
joining us on the Publisher Podcast. We hope to see you back for the next episode. Great, huge thanks goes to Jasmine Commerce for the use of her song. You can find Jasmine on SoundCloud. Go check out all of her music. We'll see you next time.